Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to talk to you about ventilatory threshold 2. Okay, so ventilatory threshold as the main concept. You'll see it first, for the most part, at least see it first here in chapter 8 when it talks about fuel for energy metabolism. So chapter 8 is the metabolism, exercise metabolism, bioenergetics. And then you'll see it a little bit more relatable to obviously exercise from a wellness fitness assessment on page 376, 77, where you're dealing with chapter 11. So you're talking about the fitness assessments themselves. So again, page 228 to 29 gives you a little bit of an intro to ventilatory threshold with respect to the actual energy metabolism, or fuel for energy metabolism, and it's pretty helpful to understand that. And just so you know that the idea or the concept of ventilatory threshold is very important if you want to get precise heart rate measurements, things like that, in relation to exercise intensity. It's just one of the more precise ways to actually gauge a person's level of intensity, right? And it gives you something to work with. Now, again, in the, I'm going to say the quote, real world, we only use VT2. Now, again, there's VT1 and there's ventilatory threshold 2. We generally only use VT2 from a precision heart rate based standpoint, intensity level perspective, when we're dealing with really fit individuals, specifically athletes, or those individuals that are trying to develop their lactic acid buffering systems or lactate buffering systems at these higher and higher intensity levels, the ability to perform events, generally, I'm going to say endurance, but moderate, even moderate, I wouldn't say sprint length, but moderate length type of races, for instance, track and field. This can be a very, very effective piece of information that will provide precise training protocols. And so VT2 gives us this sort of extra added element to programming from a precision-based perspective. Now, for pretty much everybody, we want to know about VT1, but in this video, I'm going to speak directly to ventilatory threshold 2. And before I do that, I just want to make sure you all know that you can go ahead, subscribe to the channel. If you have not done so already, head on over to our Facebook group as well, our private Facebook group for NASM exam study. Very helpful. Remember, click on any of the links that we have down below here, right? You can access our full exam study. But again, please, and also like, right? That little thumb up thing, you know what I'm talking about? So go ahead and hit the like button. Always remember, in the comment box, it's helpful for us to know whether or not the video made sense. You type the word understand in there. That would be very helpful. So what is it again? Like, right? Comments, and of course, subscribe to our channel. We would appreciate that. Okay, back to the discussion at hand, ventilatory threshold 2. Now, if you're on page 220, well, if you got to this point, 228, 229, this particular area of the textbook gives you a little bit of an introduction. And one of the main things to keep in mind when it comes to VT1 or VT2 is the type of substrate that's being used at these different heart rate levels. Now, there are physiologically at VT2, you have reached a very high level of intensity in your training. And the general understanding is that you're at what's known as a steady state level of output or exercise output. So if you're running, again, the most logical, easiest way to understand is if you're running, jogging, cycling, or even if you're swimming, that's a little bit more challenging. The understanding is that as you increase the level of intensity, when I run a little bit faster, when I'm on the treadmill and I increase the incline, what's going to happen is my heart rate is going to continue to go up, right? Concurrently with the amount of output, physical output I'm demanding from my body. Concurrently, I'm also, with elevated heart rate, I'm going to start to breathe heavier and deeper, right? So the two components to the respiration will be how deep you're breathing and the frequency of your breathing, right? So breaths per minute. And obviously, as your heart rate gets higher, you're demanding more oxygen. And so your body responds by increasing the depth of breathing and the speed or the breath count per minute. And that's going to now bring us to a very precise physiological point or a state of physiology where, and NASM will tell you this on page 229, where your body, more accurate to say your muscles are now starting to use glucose. Now, glucose is always used in the muscular system, right? Always. Free fatty acids are always being used. Even amino acids are always being used, but at very low levels. But as your output, as your exercise energy output starts to change, and in this case, go up, a couple of things start to happen at ventilatory threshold 1. If you look at the total amount of energy coming from either glucose, blood sugar, glycogen conversion into glucose versus free fatty acids, right? The two main sources of fuel during exercise. As you get to VT1, they become sort of half and half. So you're getting muscular contractions are being fueled by 50% glucose, 50% free fatty acids. Now, here's the key, as the heart rate goes up, as your overall physical output starts to increase, the intensity of your training goes up, you start to reach a point where physiologically your muscular system starts to use preferentially more and more glucose as a greater percentage of the energy being provided or needed by the muscular system. So you'll always, even at the highest energy levels, you're never going to use 100% glucose, but you can get pretty close if you're really, really tapping it out up to 95+% of true max heart rate. VT2 is basically a crossover point where we're now seeing predominantly glucose being used as a source of fuel. And this is also, just keep in mind, although they're not going to tell you in the textbook, this corresponds a lot to the fiber types that are providing the energy expenditure or output. Imagine you start to jog at a really comfortable pace, and you're fit, and you're jogging, and you're breathing comfortably, and perhaps you hit VT1 where you're just starting to have a little bit of discomfort in your breathing, and you're at about 50-50 glucose versus free fatty acid usage. You could probably sustain that forever, right? Depending on how fit you are. You can just maintain a nice, comfortable pace. But now you pick up the pace a little bit, and what's going to happen? You get past VT1, and as you approach ventilatory threshold 2, the closer you get there, the heavier the breathing. In fact, at that point, that physiological crossover point right below VT2 into VT2 and then just over, it's almost impossible for you to speak. Now, I'm not saying you can't speak. Again, it depends on your fitness level. But as you get to that point, breathing becomes more labored, more difficult. You will, just prior to crossing over that heart rate threshold known as VT2, you will be able to sustain at a steady state. You'll be able to sustain that activity for perhaps a couple of minutes. Now, again, this is all based on the fitness level and the training capacity of the particular individual. But for the average client, as their heart rate gets up to VT2, they're not going to be able to sustain that. That's where you've sprinted for 10, 15, 20 seconds, something like that. The average person simply can't maintain VT2. Now, again, I'm talking about a relatively deconditioned, unfit individual. But the more fit you are, the better your capacity to buffer the inevitable increase of lactate that builds up in your circulatory system. So as that happens, this is one of the reasons why we do what's known as lactate buffering training or lactic acid buffering training, whichever term you want to use. But with that said, that's what's going to help you to understand ventilatory threshold 2. So it's the point where glucose provides nearly all of the energy for the activity. Very straightforward here, but I wanted you to at least see this is where you'll first come into contact with ventilatory threshold 2. Again, it corresponds, this is the key, is that VT1 and VT2 correspond to specific heart rates. That's the key. This is the beauty of using ventilatory threshold as a way to set up cardiorespiratory programming if you want to get that precise. Now, again, we'll deal with intensity and understanding intensity during programming based on any number of variables that you want to use, VO2 max, right? And we have the talk test, and there's any number of ways to do it. And the point is that ventilatory threshold 1 and 2 are way more precise because they actually correspond with these physiological crossover points. So at ventilatory threshold 2, we are seeing the main point here is that we're seeing glucose being used as a main, I'm not going to give you a percentage, 95%, 98%. I don't know. It depends on the person, but you're getting pretty close to where glucose is sort of the main source. You're not using a whole bunch of pre-fatty acids at that point. But again, when you get to that level, that output heart rate, you're working really, really hard. Okay. So now with that said, let's move over to where we see the application of ventilatory threshold, and in particular VT2. Now, keep in mind that at VT1, we do want to know that for everybody because the average client still needs to have some precise level of heart rate programming if you want to be that precise. And so there's a VT1 test that you can do where you pretty much take a person to that point where breathing becomes difficult. But it's the VT2 test, and I want to make sure you get this. Not everybody needs to be doing a VT2 field test. Okay, but if you are going to, it is important to understand that we use a VT1. There's basically a talk test for that, and the VT2 talk test. And that the VT2 talk test, when you're reading this on page 376, 377, couple of things to keep in mind and considerations. And you've got 4 bullet points. I want to go over them with you. So VT2 testing only recommended for individuals with performance goals. Okay. We know that when we're training people, just the standard high intensity interval training that we're going to do with average everyday detrained clients, they will hit VT2. Of course they will. They're just not going to be able to sustain it for very long. So high intensity interval training, they're doing whatever they're doing. They're jumping jacks, and you get their heart rate up, and it's going to get up to VT2. Detrained individuals generally hit VT2 a lot faster than fit individuals will generally hit it. So it's only recommended for performance if you've got performance goals given the purpose, nature, intensity required for measuring this physiological marker. Get the idea? Not everybody's doing this. You don't need to know, quote, no, from a testing and assessment perspective, you don't need to know VT2 for everybody. They're going to get there, but it's not like you're trying to figure out, a minute here in VT2. And no, this is generally for athletes, particularly sort of mid-distance and longer distance athletes. We use it for sprint athletes only for, again, the lactate buffering training components that you can throw into a more athletic type of training scenario. Second, while several standardized field tests exist, 60-minute ride, 30 or 60-minute runs, they demand a lot of time and are tedious to administer. I am not doing VT2 tests with pretty much anybody unless they are a performance-based athlete. It just takes too much time because the VT1 test, I can get a pretty good estimate in a very short period of time because you hit VT1 fairly quick if you're doing like the treadmill. VT2 field testing requires a little bit more precision, and you got to take your time moving into it so you don't overshoot your heart rate number, and you also make sure you get to the heart rate. Ideally, just so you know, just as an aside, the best way to test for true ventilatory threshold 1 and 2 markers is through blood testing for the development of lactate, and this leads us to the anaerobic threshold, blah, blah. We ain't doing it. Just saying, we're not doing it. So unless you can, and if you can, that's great. Number three, a modified test is then what we want to do, such as a 20-minute. Now think about this. This is an easier test. When we're doing a 20-minute run or ride test, protocol provides a viable alternative, easier to conduct than the standard all the way up to a 60-minute. Ideally, a 60-minute protocol is still one of the best ways. If you're going to do a field test without taking blood and checking for the development of lactate levels, things like that, 20-minute run or ride test is a great protocol. The test requires the subject to maintain highest sustainable pace. This is the tricky part of this, for 20 minutes in the fitness professional to record the client's heart rate and marker of performance. In other words, the rating of perceived exertion, RPE, speed, and wattage. If you're using the ride, right, the bike. So and you're doing that over the last 5 minutes. So if you read through it, it's actually an interesting protocol. And you can do this. Try doing it on yourself, or again, if you have individuals that are fit, go ahead and give it a shot. Once you do some of these field testing protocols, you start to get a feel for where an individual is getting to. Because remember, with VT2 testing, field testing, you have to get people up to a certain point, heart rate level, and then the last 5 minutes, that's where you start looking and making the modifications to the intensity of the exercise to start piecing together heart rates. And you can see that. And you're going to now go ahead and write these things down. So you're going to piece all this stuff together, and then you're going to get to a point where you can figure out pretty much what that heart rate is, and that will correspond to their VT2. And so the test instructions, I'm not going to read them for you, but basically what you're doing is you discuss the protocol, answer questions. They got to do a warm-up, right? Stretch, recovery prior to conducting the test, increase intensity to and now again, this is steady state stuff. And then literally at the last 5 minutes of the 20-minute protocol, you're now increasing the intensity of the training to get their heart rate up to a certain point. And that's what you can read here. Record the individual's heart rate, marker of performance during the last 5 minutes. And now you're just going to use the average heart rates collected over that, and then correct the number, blah, blah, blah. You can read it. It is not difficult to understand the protocol, but just take your time as you go through it. And basically what you're going to do is get an heart rate, an average heart rate that corresponds to about 95%, somewhere around there. And that should obviously take you to your predicted ventilatory threshold 2 marker. Very interesting. It's not a bad idea, of course, to do it either on yourself if you can, but find a friend who doesn't mind breathing really hard for the last 5 minutes, I guess you could say. So the ventilatory threshold concept and testing, VT1 and VT2, are critical. I wanted to give you a little bit more emphasis on the ventilatory threshold 2 testing assessment protocol here, because I've had individuals ask me, how do I deal more with athletes? And if it's something you can do, you definitely want to do the VT2 testing, because once again, depending on the purpose, I'll give you an example. You have a sprinter, 100 meter, 200 meter runners. It's not a bad idea to understand training protocols with respect to their VT2. Now they're going to train obviously at VT1 above and below that, doing their interval training, whatever that particular protocol is you're going to use. And by the way, you can Google all this. This stuff is relatively easy to find. It's not like we don't know in general public how to actually train athletes when it comes to heart rate training methodology. It's just that once you're dealing with a particular human being, the VT2 testing can be extremely helpful to help 100 meter, 200 meter sprinters, for instance, to develop lactate buffering skills, particularly during the off season. Once you move into the 400, 800, mid distance, all the way into, again, all the way up to like marathon runners, triathletes, these individuals can really benefit from knowing what those heart rate numbers are. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please let us know in the comment section. If you do want full access to the NASM exam study that we provide at Body Design University, click on the link in the discussion box below. If you have any questions, particularly on this video, or by the way, on any other video, do so in the comment section. Remember, every Wednesday night, 6 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard, we do Quizlet Live. We have a live exam study that will help you pass the test. We use Quizlet. That's why I say Quizlet Live. It's a great way to study. Lots of fun, goes very fast. So 30 minutes. 6 to 6 p.m. every Wednesday night. As always, have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.